passage delves into the intricate world of international sanctions, shedding light on instances where Western nations have been subjected to punitive measures by African countries or organizations. This scenario raises intriguing questions about the capacity of African nations to assert themselves on the global stage, and whether they should exercise their authority, especially in response to alleged transgressions by Western powers like France. Beyond this, it sparks a more profound inquiry into the equilibrium of power in international relations, scrutinizing the reasons behind the disproportionate frequency of Western countries imposing sanctions on African nations, rather than the other way around. Sanctions, as succinctly defined by Wikipedia, are punitive actions taken by states or institutions against other states, groups, or individuals deemed to be in breach of international law. In essence, sanctions are akin to a formidable weapon that mighty nations, many of which are armed with nuclear capabilities, employ to exert coercive diplomacy over weaker and smaller counterparts. These sanctions can span a wide spectrum, ranging from the severing of diplomatic ties and the recall of ambassadors to curbs on trade, financial transactions, and even embargoes on arms trade. The primary objective of sanctions is to compel the targeted nation to adhere to a specific law or expectation. While sanctions can technically be wielded by any nation, they are generally exercised by those with superior economic and military prowess. Notably, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, China, France, Russia, Great Britain, and the United States, possess the authority to veto decisions, and they frequently employ sanctions as a means to further their individual national agendas. Regrettably, this strategy does not always take into consideration the aspirations of smaller and weaker countries, thereby at times exacerbating the challenges to global coexistence. Regions like Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, and the Caribbean islands continue to grapple with persistent instability, partly attributable to the structure of the UN Security Council, its undemocratic nature, and the existence of veto power. Africa, in particular, emerges as a region that bears the brunt of sanctions, often emanating from international bodies such as the UN Security Council or the European Union, as well as individual Western nations like the United States and France. Ostensibly, these sanctions are enacted to preserve peace and security. However, a vital question emerges. How do measures such as halting trade or freezing a nation's assets, actions that eventually affect the economy and the quality of life of its citizens, serve the ultimate objectives of peace and security? Paradoxically, these measures seem to disproportionately impact the general populace, rather than effectively addressing the underlying issues that precipitated the imposition of sanctions. To illustrate this conundrum, one can examine the case of Eritrea. In 2009, the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, sanctioned Eritrea, alleging its involvement in supporting terrorist organizations in Somalia and meddling in the border disputes with Djibouti. These sanctions encompassed a ban on the transfer of weapons and ammunition to Eritrea, alongside a suspension of funding and technical training for its military. Years later, it was revealed that the accusations against Eritrea's support for terrorist organizations were unfounded. Nevertheless, in 2011, further sanctions were levied, this time in the form of financial penalties affecting the mining sector's exploration and the suspension of the 2% diaspora taxes paid by Eritreans living abroad. As these harsh sanctions were globally implemented, the people of Eritrea voiced their dissent and appealed to the 15 members of the UN Security Council to reconsider and lift the sanctions through letters, emails, and faxes. Unfortunately, their pleas received limited attention and support. However, a decade after the initial imposition of sanctions, the UN Security Council finally withdrew them in 2018. This example underscores the plight of a nation that endured sanctions for a decade based on unverified allegations. Furthermore, the passage examines another facet of the issue, shedding light on the ease with which the UN Security Council, the European Union, and Western nations impose sanctions on African nations, the African Union, and regional blocs like the Economic Community of West African States. ECOWAS. African organizations face criticism for perceived inefficiency, which may inadvertently open the door to external meddling. This external intervention, whether in the form of sanctions or military operations, as witnessed in the case of Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, raises questions about the ability of African organizations to effectively mediate disputes between African nations. A study on UN Security Council sanctions in Africa reveals that the African Union collaborated in implementing 60% of these measures. A clear illustration of this cooperation can be found in the imposition of harsh financial and economic sanctions on Niger, following the overthrow of Mohamed Bazoum in a coup. ECOWAS, with assistance from France and the United States, led this initiative to restore peace and stability in Niger. In response, Western nations such as the United States, European Union, and France also imposed their own sanctions on the country. Nevertheless, the people and economy of Niger bore the brunt of these sanctions, leaving critics to ponder whether the enforcement of sanctions and allowance of military incursions inadvertently facilitate external interference, thereby raising doubts about the ability of these organizations to genuinely serve the interests of the continent. The passage emphasizes the necessity of evaluating the effectiveness of African organizations in fostering peace and stability, compelling readers to reconsider their position within the continent. The idea of implementing policies that exacerbate food and medicine shortages, alongside inflation, as a means to restore stability within a region is questioned. Additionally, the passage underscores how the efforts of the African Union and regional blocs have inadvertently made African countries more susceptible to external intervention. This observation extends to the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, as well. It is worth noting that if these institutions were effectively executing their mandates, there would be little justification for the European Union and other European nations to intervene in African affairs at will. Despite the detrimental consequences of Western involvement, the African Union and ECOWAS continue to seek approval and assistance from the West during crises in Africa, as evidenced by the Libyan situation. The passage underscores the disastrous outcomes of such operations and raises concerns about whether ECOWAS and the African Union are, in effect, conduits advancing Western agendas. This leads to a broader discussion on Western policy toward African countries. The passage highlights that African presidents with Western support often evade sanctions, even amidst allegations of corruption and misconduct, while leaders who oppose specific agendas risk facing consequences. Overall, the passage advocates for Africa to assert its independence and rethink its relationship with the West. It emphasizes the need for Africa to resist external pressure and adopt a more autonomous approach to development and governance. The passage underscores that Africa has historically been a target of Western intervention and meddling, but there is a growing movement calling for a change in this dynamic. The proposed course of action calls for significant shifts in diplomatic relations, moving beyond simple economic measures. Africa is encouraged to reduce its reliance on the West by exploring alternative alliances with nations such as China, Russia, and other Asian countries. Additionally, the passage suggests reciprocating travel restrictions and banning firms that exploit African resources and harm the environment. The ultimate objective is to transform Africa into a more self-reliant and autonomous entity, reducing dependence on external forces. Achieving this transformation necessitates a bold re-evaluation of Africa's relationship with the West, one that fosters resilience and self-determination. The passage concludes by advocating for changes in the security landscape on the continent, including, "We sincerely value your perceptive engagement. We eagerly invite you to grace us with your thoughts and insights in the comments section below. Your support is the beacon guiding our journey, so we humbly request your consideration in liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. As you savor our content, ponder the possibility that your network of friends and cherished family members might discover these videos as intriguing gems. Thank you for your invaluable time and vibrant participation.